So tonight, as you know, if you've been at the park for any in recent times, I realise not everybody has, not everyone's a regular here tonight. We've been doing a series in Mark's Gospel, and all the way as we've been going through Mark's Gospel, you may not have noticed, but I've been dropping in little bits of archaeology along the way. Like showing you pictures of the temple. What else have I shown you? I think I've showed you some. I showed you coin this morning, didn't I? We'll come back to that one in a minute. Because I just find this stuff fascinating. I find it fascinating. I always have done. But it's not always appropriate. Like, you can't sort of talk about archaeology for 15, 20 minutes in a sermon. So it's just nice to be able to have a bit of time to work through some of this stuff tonight. If you've got questions along the way, please do just shout out. I can't promise I'll know the answers because I'm an engineer, not an archaeologist, all right? I'm not an expert at all in this stuff, but I've got some good books, and honestly, there's so much good stuff online these days. One thing I would say about online resources with biblical archaeology is you have to be careful, because some of it, frankly, is pretty fantasist. Honestly, there are Christians out there who desperately want to find rock-solid proof of stuff. And they'll latch on to even the tiniest thing and construct some great story behind it that honestly just doesn't stack up with a recognised understanding of archaeology. So you just got to be a little bit careful online. There are some crazies out there, I tell you. Anyway, let's get back to Mark's Gospel. So honestly, there's less archaeology in Mark's Gospel. There's less references to archaeology in Mark than there are in the other Gospels. And I think that's partly just because of the nature of how it's been written. So, for example, Matthew, as Matthew writes his Gospel, he wants to show to the Jewish people that this is your Messiah. And he does so by referring to all kinds of Jewish stuff that he sees around him. And with Luke's Gospel, Luke says, I've tried to make a really orderly account, haven't I? And in fact, we'll read a little bit of Luke in a bit, actually. And so Luke puts in a lot of details of people and places and all kinds of stuff like that. Honestly, Mark's big message is, Jesus is amazing. And you probably won't remember the very, very first sermon I did on Mark's Gospel. But all the way through Mark's Gospel, it goes, basically, this is a summary of Mark's Gospel. Jesus did this, and this, and then he did this, and this, and then he did this, and then he did this, and then he did this, and it was amazing. That's basically what Mark's Gospel is, all right? So there's less archaeology in Mark than there are in the other Gospels, in all honesty. But there is some. So we're going to have a look at some of it. So first thing I want you to look at. So this is, what you're looking at there, is the earliest known bit of manuscript of Mark's Gospel. You can go and see it if you ask nicely at Oxford University, one of the libraries there. It's called P137, they call it. And what you're looking at there is the front and back of one little fragment. It's only about this big, it's quite small. Okay? You look at the front and the back of it there, and what you're looking at is Mark chapter 1, verse 7 to 9 on one side. On the back side of it, it's Mark chapter 1, verses 16 to 18. And it was discovered in 1903 by some archaeology students in Egypt. Basically, they were excavating a rubbish dump, and they found a pot full of tiny scraps of papyrus. And they didn't know what it was, honestly, because if you imagine a pot, you're going to see a picture of a pot in a minute, one of these pots, but you imagine a pot like this, full of little tiny scraps. It's a bit like you've taken your manuscripts and put it through a shredder, okay? And it was only published, the research for this manuscript was only published in 2018. So it took like 115 years to get from discovery to identifying it for sure. Now this has been dated to AD 150. Okay, so this is This is getting on for 2,000 years old. You may have seen, if you like this kind of thing on social media, you may have seen this about 5-6 years ago on social media. There was, and like I said, you've got to be careful of stuff you see online. So there was this big explosion of stuff all over social media about this, because one of the scholars who was researching it reckoned that it dated from the 1st century. So like within, only a few years of Jesus' death and resurrection. But now they reckon it's about AD 150 to AD 200, which is still incredibly old. But we actually have earlier bits of all the other Gospels. So now, how did we get this? There's a guy called Irenaeus of Lyon who so after the apostles died. Okay, so this is sort of first year Bible college stuff. So after the apostles died, who led the church next? Okay, there was a bunch of guys, and we called them the church fathers. All right, so that's the generation that came after the apostles and the generation after that. And one of these guys called Irenaeus, about 150 AD, he said this. He wrote this rather. Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, did also hand down to us in writing what had been preached by Peter. Okay, so this guy about 150 AD says this is how Mark's gospel came to be. Basically, it's Mark writing down Peter's thoughts and memories. So that's how we know what Mark's gospel is. Let's go on to the next one. Okay. So I promise there's only 2 little manuscripts tonight. We're not going to be doing an hour of this stuff. This one, okay, so this one, I said the previous one was the earliest one that's been found. This one is controversial, all right, but it's so exciting, I'm going to share it with you anyway. So it's known as 7Q5, and it was found with the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you know about the Dead Sea Scrolls? Yeah, a little bit about the Dead Sea Scrolls. So discovered in, I think it was 1948, and the West Bank in Israel. I think it was Jordan back then, actually. But anyway, so basically some pots, like that pot up there that you can see, a series of caves full of these pots. And inside these pots, there's a bunch of very, very old manuscripts, mostly papyrus. And it was a remarkable discovery. It's arguably, it's the greatest archaeological discovery ever made. And the reason for that is that, twofold really. One is just the sheer number of the quantity of stuff they found. So there were literally tens of thousands of fragments like this one. And second, because it's extremely old. So they date before 100 AD for sure, and some of them considerably older than that. And they were probably collected by a group called the Essenes. Now, if you were here this morning, we didn't talk about the Essenes. They're another sort of group, but they're not mentioned in the Bible actually. But they were a bunch of basically, I said this morning actually, didn't I? I said, so one of the dangers that Christians sometimes fall into is being completely devoted to God and ignoring society around them. That's kind of what the Essenes did. They were like hermits at the time of Jesus. Probably the Essenes gathered all these documents together, and as the temple was destroyed in AD 70, just chaos in the country, they hid it all away, sealed it all up, and forgot about it. It was lost for nearly 2,000 years. And the exciting thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls is that when you compare the manuscripts that they wrote from best part of 2,000 years ago, and you compare them to the ones from AD 300, AD 500, AD 1000, 1600, you see that actually what was written back then is almost, for all intents and purposes, identical to the much, much later documents, which means that as it was copied down the centuries, it means the Bible that we have, the Old Testament that we have, is very, very accurate. Just because these very old ones say the same, basically, as the much newer ones. This particular fragment is what was I going to say about this particular one? Right, so this particular one is probably, Mark chapter 6, verse 52 to 53. And on the screen there, you can see, so that the bits in red are what's actually on that fragment. That's the remains of what's on that fragment. And Mark 6 is written out there, the Greek text. So, nobody's quite certain if this is definitely Mark 6 yet. But if it is, which is certainly possible, certainly plausible, it's extremely exciting because this has been dated to AD 50, which would make it the oldest fragment of any New Testament manuscript that's ever been discovered. And it would make it quite plausibly a copy of what Mark actually wrote. You know, to be AD 50 would be incredibly early. So that would be really cool. But it's very small. I mean, it's only like that big. So, yeah. Anyway, but that's the kind of thing that archaeologists are looking at the moment. Let's talk about something else. So, as you read the first few chapters of Mark's Gospel, it's all centered on the town of Capernaum. It's probably where Jesus lived. It's certainly where Peter and Andrew and James and John lived. Now, this synagogue. Okay, so what you're looking at here is a synagogue. Okay, Jewish local church, effectively. And it was first discovered in 1852. And when they found it, it was basically it was kind of covered over in meters of dirt because it's been there for a couple of thousand years or so. And the archaeologists who discovered it, they found it, and the political situation locally was so bad that they decided it would actually be dangerous to try and excavate something so precious right now. So they planted crops over the top of it, just to hide it, basically, and came back to it in 1905. Like I said, archaeology moves very slowly, right? So 50-odd years later, they came back to it and started to excavate the site. And they thought they'd found Jesus' synagogue, because Capernaum wasn't a big place. So if you look, this is the bit we read just now. Yeah, so chapter 121, and once Capernaum, Jesus went to the synagogue and began to teach. And there's a few other references to Jesus teaching in the synagogue. I think chapter 2. Yeah, when Jesus heals the paralyzed man. Remember the man with the... is it the man with the withered hand? No, it's not actually. No, it's where they lower the man through the roof. That's in Capernaum as well. I think chapter 3 is in the synagogue. Anyway, yeah, chapter 3, verse 1 is in the synagogue. Anyway, so they thought, we've discovered Jesus' synagogue here, which would be tremendously exciting, of course. Kept on excavating, though. By 1981, they discovered that actually this isn't Jesus' synagogue. It's like, crushing disappointment. What they found was that this synagogue, they reckon now, was built in about 300 AD. But what they discovered was, my computer's just shut down, what they discovered was, I don't know if you can see that. They discovered, you see the top, so this building here was built in about 8300. That's this building here, but the foundation it's built on there is much older. So the foundation it's built on is the synagogue where Jesus walked. Nobody doubts that. That is absolutely 100%. Everybody believes that now. So I think that's amazing. So you can go to Galilee. You could get on a plane tonight, go over there, and pay your tourist tax to get in there, whatever that costs. And you can go and stand on the very floor of the synagogue that Jesus taught and preached. You remember when, I think it's John chapter 6, when Jesus is talking about the bread of life? That little speech is given in that synagogue, where that bit of floor. I think that's so cool, that you can actually go to these places. Yeah. Let's talk about this guy. Herod the Great. Herod the Great. All right. So I mentioned the Herodians this morning, if you were paying attention. This political party who was sort of allied to King Herod and his family. Now, there are 3 Herods in the Bible. Do you realise that? I think there's 7 Marys. It's just really hard to keep track. There are 3 different King Herods in the Bible. So there's the first one, which Herod the Great. Herod the Great built the temple. There you go. You've seen that picture before, I think, if you've been here for a while. So Herod the Great built this thing. He was kind of Jewish. He married into the Jewish faith, but honestly, he built big temples for all the other religions as well. He was a pragmatist, trying to keep people on side. He was also a paranoid psychopath. I could tell you some crazy stories about Herod, but he executed most of his family, most of his own children. It was said, one of the Caesars, was it Caesar Augustus? Yes, it was. Caesar Augustus said, famously, he said, "I'd rather be Herod's pig than his son." Okay, and there's a bit of a play on words because pig and son sound very similar in Greek. But basically what he was saying was that Herod, as a token Jew, would have real problems killing a pig, but actually killing his son's no problem. Okay, that's what he was like. When Herod the Great died, one of his final wishes was that all the important people from all over the area be gathered together in the, I can't remember where it was now, all be gathered together and all executed. And his reasoning was, like, nobody's going to miss me when I die, so at least if I kill all the important, precious people in the country, there's going to be plenty of weeping and mourning on my day of my death. That's what he was like. As it happened, they did gather them together, but they didn't actually go through with it. I think once he died, everyone was like, "Hey, brilliant!" and got on with their lives, which is great. So anyway, so Herod the Great. Herod doesn't appear in Mark's Gospel. I mention him though because this is Herod who executed all the baby boys in Bethlehem. That's this Herod, all right? He doesn't appear in Mark's Gospel, but I mentioned him because he did build the temple. And the Herodians, which are in Mark's Gospel, come out of his family. This Herod does appear, though. So this is Herod Antipas. So after Herod the Great died, his kingdom was split between 3 of his 4 sons. One of them is this guy, Herod Antipas. And there's in Mark's Gospel, in Mark chapter 6, you may remember the story of John the Baptist, and John accuses Herod of being like a terrible. In fact, should we just turn to it very quickly? If you've got a Bible with you, Mark 6. Yeah, so Mark 6:14, King Herod heard about this, for Jesus' name had become well known. And some were saying John the Baptist had been raised from the dead because Herod had murdered him. Because, verse 17, Herod put John in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, whom he married, which is a horrible sentence construction. But basically, Herod divorced his wife illegally, married his brother's wife instead. It's just very messy. John the Baptist said, "You can't do this." So Herod had him put in prison and later executed. That Herod is this Herod here. That's a statue from the time of him. I can't remember where that statue is right now. I haven't got that in my notes. Anyway, there's another Herod as well who appears in the book of Acts, but again, not in Mark. So this is Tiberius Julius Caesar Augustus. Okay, so this is the guy who was the emperor of Rome at the time of Jesus. All right, so we read this morning, didn't we? Mark 12, when Jesus says, "Someone go get me a denarius." It's interesting, isn't it? I didn't mention this morning, but interesting that Jesus didn't have any money on him. You know, I think if you want to pursue wealth in life, probably Jesus is not your role model. Just saying. So Jesus says, bring me a denarius, and he said, whose image is this on here? And it's this guy. So this is what would have been on there. Now, what's interesting is the inscription around the outside of the coin. Okay, this is what it says: Tiberius, son of the divine Augustus. Okay, so in Roman culture, basically the emperor was God. As far as the Romans were concerned, the emperor was certainly a god. Okay, the divine Augustus. Okay, that was his dad's name. So this guy's Tiberius. If his dad was Augustus, okay, so if Augustus is the divine Augustus, what does that make Tiberius? It makes him the son of God. You see? Now, can you see why the Jews hated paying their tax to Rome? Because every time they had to even handle Roman money, they were committing this appalling blasphemy. That even the very coins that they had to give to Rome, the Roman coins, said the emperor is the son of God. And that's why it was very difficult for Christians in the first century as well. Because this is why Nero, 30 years later, this is why Nero executed so many of them, partly at least, because the Christians refused to say Caesar is God. They would say, well, no, Jesus is God, Jesus is Lord. And you can just see the tension there, can't you? Even on the coins that you have to handle every single day of the week, it denies what you fundamentally believe. Yeah. Let's look at some more coins. Okay, so obviously there are other coins as well, just like we do. So the denarius is in the top left there. A denarius that Jesus said, bring me one of these. So a denarius was about a day's wages for a labourer. Okay, so if you remember in Matthew 20, Jesus tells the parable of the good landowner who says goes out into the marketplace at the start of the day and says, come and work in my vineyard, I'll pay you a denarius. But they had other coins as well. The next one down was called an Assyrion. A 16 Assyrion was one denarius, which must have made the maths very hard. I don't know why. Anyway, actually, if you're an IT guy, that does make sense. It makes sense, doesn't it? Because you work in hexadecimal. Brilliant. Yeah. You like that. But for most people, 16, not a good combination. So when Jesus says, aren't 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies, it says in the NIV. It's actually Assyrion, okay? It's about the cost of a loaf of bread, all right? So 16 of those little coppery-looking coins were 1 denarius. Next week, we're going to be looking in Mark 12 again, and you've got the story of, I remember the widow, the people are putting money into the temple, into the big pot to pay the taxes and whatever, make the donations to the temple. Little old lady comes along with 2 very small copper coins worth only a few pence, is what the NIV says, which is a very long way of putting 2 lepton. Is actually what it says in Greek. So 2 lepton, which you can see on the bottom left there, 2 lepton are worth 1 quadrans. I think I've said that right. Quadrans. And 4 quadrans is 1 Assyrion. And 16 Assyrion are 1 denarius. So it's 1/128th of a day's wages. So it is not very much, actually, at all. 2 tiny little bronze coins. And those pictures there are about the best 2 lepton that we still have today, because they're absolutely minuscule. They're about the size of your little fingernail, made out of copper, and basically I mean, there must have been millions and millions of them made, but of course they've all just disintegrated into nothing now. So those are about the best two that I could manage to find photos of. So let's talk about, I've only got 3 slides left, I think. Two slides left. So, Pilate. Let's talk about Pilate, Pontius Pilate. So Mark chapter 15, we meet Pontius Pilate. And he's mentioned in various different pieces of ancient literature, actually. So a guy called Phileo Judaeus, who was a Jewish philosopher in the mid-1st century. He mentions Pilate a couple of times in his writings. And just, have you heard of Josephus? You know who Josephus is? The Jewish historian. Yeah, if you've been to university and had all the UCCF training, you'll know all about Josephus. Josephus, he talks about Pilate loads. The guy called Tacitus, who was a Greek or Roman? Ooh, anyway, it doesn't really matter. He was a historian, 2nd century historian. He said this. I didn't put this on the screen, sadly. He said this. Christus, from whom the name... Start again. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty, which is crucifixion, of course. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. Now, there have been, so there's lots and lots of written references to this guy Pilate from 1st, 2nd, 3rd century. No one really doubts his existence, although if you look at the websites of some Christian apologists, they will say, oh, nobody used to believe in Pilate. They did, actually. They always have done. But what's significant is that until recently, no one had any physical evidence. So lots of mentions of him in manuscripts, which is good enough. That's great. But nothing actually physical until 1961. So they were excavating a theatre, a Roman theatre in Caesarea, which is a little village next to the sea, and they were uncovering the steps at the back of the theatre. They discovered this piece of stone that had been recycled into a step. Okay, so it wasn't originally a step, but they found some old bits of rock and made it into a set of steps. When they turned it over, this was what was written on the underside. It says, to Emperor Tiberius, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated, and the rest of it's missing. It probably says this building. It was probably I don't know, we don't know what it was, some kind of civic building of some sort. So this is basically a plaque, a monument put there. You can imagine on the opening day of whatever this civic building was, I don't know, some Roman office building. Pilate had been there for the opening and dedicated this building to his boss, the Emperor Tiberius. That's really cool, I think. You know So now we have some physical, solid evidence that Pilate existed, rather than just written records. We actually have something physical that you can touch and feel. If you go to the Israel Museum, you can go and see it for yourself. And that dates from AD 30. So just around the time when Jesus was beginning his ministry, Pilate was there in Caesarea, probably, opening some office building, as dignitaries tend to do. There you go. I'll show you one more. So on the left there, so that's a ring, okay? It was discovered in 1968 near Bethlehem, and it's a sealing ring. Do you know what a sealing ring is? Yeah. So if you're even today, do we still use them? I don't know. I'm not a solicitor. Yes. Yeah, do we still use them? Do they? Banks use them. So it's when you've got an important document or something and you put a bit of wax on it, then you put a seal on it, which is your seal. It proves that you've sealed it, all right, that you've made that mark. So that ring on the black thing you can see on the left there, that was used by someone to mark official documents and receipts. Now, no one knew what that was, actually, when it was found in 1968 near Bethlehem. But it was only in 2018 when, so that's what, that's 68, 2018, 78, 88, 98, 08. It's 50 years later, so I'm rubbish at maths. 50 years later, I said the wheels turn slowly in archaeology. 50 years later, someone tried photographing it with some new fancy camera, and they saw the image on the right. And from that, they could see that it says Pilato, Pilate. And it turns out this probably didn't belong to Pilate himself, because it's obviously it's a bit of a rubbish ring. It's made of copper and it's not very fancy. But it would have been used by one of his staff, someone in his office, to seal up documents. I think that's really cool. Like stuff. This is stuff that's people in the Bible. That we have physical evidence that they existed and they went around their everyday lives. This is the stuff they did. And I just think it's remarkable that, honestly, anything exists from 2,000 years ago. I think that's amazing. That even these little bits and pieces, that we have any of that stuff. But my point really is that there's more stuff coming out all the time. There's huge amounts of archaeology going on in the Middle East right now. And honestly, the discipline of archaeology only started about 1850. And you heard me say earlier that something they found in 1850, they didn't even get around to excavating until like 60 years later or something. And there's so much going on right now, and we can absolutely expect to find lots and lots of very exciting stuff over the next few decades, over the next 100 years. I've restricted everything I've said tonight to things that directly relate to Mark's Gospel, but there's lots of very, very exciting stuff that I haven't mentioned that isn't in Mark's Gospel. And what I absolutely love is that nothing that's been found contradicts anything that's in the Scriptures. It just fits. It just fits. And I love, if you read beginning of Luke, I think it's Luke chapter 3. So Luke says things like this. So Luke cares a lot more about dates and people than Mark does, all right? Luke says this. In the 15th, this will make more sense to you now. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, when Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene. And you think, what are all these names about? Who cares? During the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah. And you think, well, why is he giving us all these names? And isn't it great that he did? Because actually, it means that today we can find physical evidence of these people. And we find that, actually this was in the reign of Tiberius Caesar, and Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea, and Herod was the tetrarch, it's called, king of Galilee, and his brother Philip was also a tetrarch, because the Bible tells us that he married his brother's wife. It all fits together. It's so amazing. I think it's absolutely amazing. Anyway. One more thing, all right? I'll do it, Joe. There you go. Does anybody know what that thing on the right is? It's something that we don't use in our culture, but other cultures do. Sorry?
Sarcophagus?
Yeah, basically. It's called an ossuary. An ossuary, which is basically so when you bury a body in a hot country, what you can do, instead of burying it in the ground, you can just put it in a cave, and then a few months later you go back and you gather up the bones, because that's all that's left. You put them in a box, and then you bury the box. Okay, it's kind of saves space, basically. I think that's the motivation for it. we'll come back to that. Anyone have any idea what the other picture is? The bigger one?
The bone that's got a nail through it.
It is a bone with a nail
I
through
couldn't
it.
tell you which bone.
It's an ankle bone. It's an ankle bone. A heel bone, rather. It's that bit of your foot there. And it has a nail through it. It was found in 1968 in Jerusalem. Some builders were building something like you do. And the thing is, when you build something in Jerusalem, basically, you've got a good chance of finding something interesting, because there's just that much history and archaeology in the city of Jerusalem. So they started building, they discovered this burial site, they discovered this ossuary, this bone box here on the right, and this bone was inside with some other bones as well. Now, there's three things that are significant about this finding, all right? First of all, is it shows how crucifixions were done. Certainly some crucifixions. I mean, you can't guarantee they always did it the same way, but it's I think it's the only physical evidence we have of how a crucifixion was actually done. So with a nail right through the heel bone into the wood. So not through your toes, not through the middle of your leg, but through the heel. That's how they did this one anyway. And it's likely that this particular one, when the body was, it's likely that when they nailed it in, maybe it hit a knot in the wood or something and bent, or there must have been some reason why, when the body was given back to the family, that they didn't take the nails out. Like usually you would do that. If you're burying your loved one, you'd take the nails out. For some reason they didn't here, whether it's because it was bent over and it would have been too difficult to, you can imagine, pretty messy. For whatever reason, they buried the body with the nail embedded in the foot. Second significant thing is that the leg bones of this person have been broken, which is interesting, isn't it? Because that's what it says in the Gospels as well, that they said that break his legs, break Jesus' legs so that he'll die more quickly. That's what they did if they wanted to kill someone a bit more. Because honestly, because crucifixion took days for people to die. It was just it was the most horrendous, humiliating way to die. And very often the bodies were left on the crosses for the birds to peck at for a while. It was just a terrible, terrible way to die. But if they wanted to kill someone quickly, they break the leg bones, because then you can't support your own weight, and you just die of suffocation very quickly. The third significant thing about it is that this body was buried in a proper tomb. It was properly buried. You see, for years and years and years, people have questioned the idea that that Jesus' body would have been given back to the family. And we think, well, of course they're given back to the family. Well, no, not necessarily. See, in Roman times, a body belonged to the state. And actually, the thinking was the Romans would have just buried them all in a mass grave. And sometimes, probably did that sometimes, because sometimes there were hundreds or even thousands of people crucified at one time. But the thinking was, like, this is just implausible, that they would give the body back to the family, that Joseph of Arimathea, isn't it? Goes to Pilate, I want to say Pilate, and asks for the body back. People say, well, that's just implausible, because, the body would have just been chucked in a big grave somewhere. It's just waste, refuse. Well, what this shows is that, no, actually, even crucified criminals, the bodies, at least sometimes, were given back to the family for a proper burial. So that's really helpful. That's really helpful archaeological evidence, and it just helps us to defend our faith against people who sometimes treat the Gospels with a great deal of cynicism, when really they always treat the Gospels as a very, very good piece of archaeological evidence itself.